Of course, I was behind on my screen, I'm
I was
sorry.
listening to you about, guess you were talking about driving from Fairhope here, yeah.
And I said there was a social action meeting, so I came for that. So it was fine to stay through, but to come for 1 hour would have been I could have talked myself out of it really easy.
Right.
Are there some coming from that meeting to this?
Gil and I.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So would you rather it have been 1 3-hour session or you like it an hour every week?
We stayed longer, and I don't think I would like it. That's my preference.
That's what I said, next time, maybe we do a one-off and try it at different times. I mean, the Sunday afternoon is great for some people. Other people may want a Wednesday evening.
Yes, right.
We gotta just keep trying things.
I wonder if you could send out like a questionnaire, maybe.
That's a good point.
For something, just to get it, because maybe a lot of people don't want to take up their Sunday. If you have people that work, and maybe it'd be better.
But then for me that works, Sunday's the only day I can comfortably get here. I can plan I'll stop at the grocery store on my way home, I can plan around it.
Yeah.
Right.
But during the week,
Do you work at the store, or are you
all of it. It's a small family business, we do it all.
Yeah.
Which is, that's what makes it exciting.
Yeah.
This is not some kid around this kid.
That's the original.
This is what we call a builder, which is
Right. Yeah, that's, I want you to see that. No, well,
Or whatever you.
are we starting?
Oh, I should mention something after we're done.
Okay.
Okay. After we're done, tonight is officially Simchat Torah, the celebration of the ending and the beginning of the Torah. For the religious school, we moved it from 4 o'clock to this morning, and part of the curriculum was the unfolding of the Torah. We unraveled it as far as we could go very safely. I had 2 people, David and Danette and their son Max, help me at 9:15 in the morning. It's very secure. If after the presentation, any of you would like a little tour of it and see where things are, and I can point things out to you.
That's great.
You're more than happy. You're more than welcome to do that. I don't want to cut into our.
No, and we might, if we can, we may finish a little early so you can do that. That's great.
Whatever,
That's great.
There's so much material to cover, but.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, welcome back.
Taste of Judaism pie, I think I recommend it.
Say that again?
This is a Taste of Judaism class, right?
Right.
That's a big slice of Judaism pie. You need
Yeah.
to see that Torah.
That, when we named it that, I was hesitant in one sense because I thought people are gonna think it's a cooking class. We're ready, and I'm like, I'm sorry. Well, welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back. That's amazing, considering. First of all, I printed this out. I went to about 3 or 4 sources, trying to see some consistency, some commonalities. But this is the 613 laws. And when you mentioned that, I thought, I'm going to find it and print it out. And then this one was kind of the most trustworthy, I think, of all of them. And I hate to say, but it came from Chabad. And because they got that website is awesome. I mean, my daughter, who's very, very progressive Reform Jew, and she doesn't like when I talk about Chabad too much. But I tell her it's a great resource, I think.
There's no, well, if you want the very traditional, very orthodox view, certainly the Chabad website is excellent. A more complicated resource, and you need some instruction in terms of how you use it, is Sefaria.org. Sefaria.org has all any Jewish religious text you can imagine that's digitized, it's online, and you can click and go to any source. You want to look at a chapter 36 of Exodus, you can. You want to look at a section of the Talmud, a certain page you're interested in, you can go to that page. I mean, it is voluminous. The problem with that is that it's, you sort of have to know kind of like what you're looking for to navigate some, there's a learning curve with that. With Chabad, the Chabad website, if you want
Very
traditional
easy.
Judaism, and you have a question, understand you're not gonna get a Reform perspective, you're gonna get a very Orthodox perspective, that's the place to go.
And URJ, who we pay big money to be members of, that's another issue, is where I go first for a lot of these things, but I have to say the website to me is hard to navigate and hard to get just, I want to know this prayer, I want to know this information.
Right.
Don't you find it's kind of crazy? And I'll spend 30 minutes trying to dig around in there, and I went, okay.
And then it throws you
Chabad.
in CCAR, it throws
Just
you
call me.
in.
Just call me.
That's great.
That's what you all pay me the big bucks for.
Touche. To
I'm
call
more
the
than happy to
rabbi.
try. If I can't, I don't have the answer, I'll spend the time looking at
Oh,
it.
that's fair.
Okay, that's
I like
fine.
that,
I'll
yes.
probably end up at the Chabad website if I don't.
No, but you know what? That's good. Call the rabbi. Yes.
2 questions. How do you spell, did you say Safari?
Right, Safari, or really Sifriya, which means library in Hebrew.
Yeah, but how,
Sefaria, Safaria.
okay.
Kind of like, think of a safari,
Oh,
and then add the A to it, .org. It's a
That's
wonderful
so
website.
cool.
and for those that may not know, tell us what URJ stands for. It may sound
Yeah, thank you. No,
self-explanatory.
it's not.
Oh, yes.
Union.
Union of Reformed Judaism, which this temple and most Reformed congregations, established congregations around the country are members of this American organization. It's a central organization that promotes Reformed Judaism, but also provides resources and through which we can hire rabbis and we can all kinds of things. Are the dues still real expensive?
And it includes congregations in the United States and Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, North America is what it is.
Very good. Sorry. Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
So how long has Chabad been around?
Oh,
Well, I can sort of answer that.
yes. I'm not sure.
So Chabad equals Lubavitch. And Lubavitch is actually, I believe, was a town, I don't think it is, it may exist, I'm not sure, in Eastern Europe. And that's where the Lubavitchers came from. And before the Holocaust, I think it was before, the Rebbe, they have a Rebbe, the person who is the head of this, I'm sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Mendelssohn.
If you would tell us what Rabbi.
Oh, I'm sorry, good.
Mendelssohn,
A Rebbe, it's a very unique term. I've been called that, and I have quickly dissuaded people that I am not their Rebbe. The Rebbe is a very, he's kind of like, I have to use he, because it's a father figure. And that the people who follow, who are in the Hasidic movement, they have a Rebbe. And when they have any question, sometimes even as simple as, what stove should I buy? They will go to the Rebbe and ask the Rebbe, and they'll do anything, basically what the Rebbe tells them to do. For example, if the Rebbe tells them to vote for such and such a candidate, they will vote in block for that candidate. There will not be a dissent. I mean, I'm not really exaggerating, there may be one or two, but that's why, for example, in New York, where many Hasidic Jews live, they vote as a block. There's not much dissent. Why? Because the Rebbe is telling them what's the right thing. And they're very holy, very, they're very sincere people. I'm not criticizing. That's the way the movement is. It started around the 18th century. So it goes back a long, long way. Anyway, so in the Lubavitch situation, they came over en masse on boat. I'm not quite sure when they came over, but I think it was before the Second World War. I don't think it was after. And they settled in New York. And like most of the Hasidim, most of the Hasidic movement, when I was growing up and when I went to the yeshiva, they really kept to themselves. They were really separate. They didn't look for adherents. They didn't go out and knock on doors or anything of that nature. Then a new Rebbe came, and by the way, it's all dynastic for the most part. In other words, you have to be born. It's kind of like the crown almost. It's kind of like that. I mean, it's not quite as dysfunctional, but it's, kind of, I'm not a joke. The families are not dysfunctional, I'm sure they're wonderful families. Anyway, so Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Rebbe who some people in the movement claim to be the Messiah. Some people feel that he was so out of this world that he was the Messiah. He never denied it, and he never admitted to it. So there was a whole mystery surrounding that. He decided that what was important, particularly after the Holocaust, to get Jews to do mitzvot, to do commandments, to put tefillin on, for example, to come into a sukkah and to recite a blessing and do outreach. Before that, the Hasidic movement, no one in the Hasidic movement did any kind of outreach. And he organized and got a fair amount of money to support people who would then go out and, for lack of not proselytizing in this, but would seek out Jews who were not practicing Jews. And sometimes they would be Reformed Jews, sometimes they would be conservative Jews. And they would knock on doors of people that they suspected were Jewish and try to get them to do mitzvah. Come to the Chabad house for Shabbos dinner, and so forth and so on. And some people found it very appealing, and some people began to join the Hasidic movement, join the Lubavitchers, who became known as Chabad. Okay, and yeah, go ahead, please.
So are all of these, all of these are Orthodox Jews,
Very
right?
Orthodox,
Chabad, Hasidic.
Well,
Right.
and
Yeah,
Chabad
there's
is part of the
different-
Hasidim.
That's what
Right,
that's
yeah,
my
yeah,
next question.
Right, the Hasidim, or I'm sorry,
Just a
the
broad
Hasidim is a broad term encompassing various subsets of groups. For example, Chabad is a subset of the Hasidim. The Satmars, the ones who deny the existence of Israel or the legitimacy of Israel, and who you may have read about, that's a separate sect of the Hasidim. And then there's other. There is, I forget, there's a bunch of them.
But Orthodox is not part of that.
That's an interesting question. And think of it as a spectrum. Okay, think of orthodoxy as a spectrum, much like you might think of a disease, or I can, it being on a spectrum. On the far right would be, I would say, the Hasidim. Further than the far right, I would say would be the Satmars. They're part of the Hasidic, but part of the spectrum of orthodoxy, where they adhere and follow certain teachings based on this text. But it's complicated, goes a little more complicated than that. Then you have this kind of middle group who are just Orthodox, okay? Who believe that the Torah was given by God to Mount Sinai. And then you have modern Orthodox, which is more to the left of Orthodoxy, but very much to the right of Reform, and right to the conservative movement. Is that helpful? So
Yeah, no, this is fascinating.
And
Keep going, right?
please.
And in that entire spectrum, women sit separate from men in the congregation. We were talking about the service, Hebrew, English, 99% Hebrew, the service. So, but that, and even within our Mobile conservative reform, there are people that are members of the shul that are as reform as any reform person here. And there are some of us at this congregation that are kind of conservative. I mean, we're such a small community. It's very hard to decipher that line here.
Yeah, there's kind of a joke that I make that really
Yeah.
Rabbi Silverman is more liberal and more reformed than I am, and I'm more conservative, I think, in some respects than Rabbi Silverman.
Well,
But that's the beauty of reform. Is that
right,
it doesn't mean you can throw things away. It just means that you
can apply what's
choose.
meaningful to you.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And Chabad, it's interesting because the Rabbi Mobile, Goldwasser, really, really nice guy, just sweet, nice guy. And I've picked him apart and sat him down and says, well, what about your children? How are they educated? I wanted to know all kinds of things. They're educated at home. What about their friends? Do they socialize? Do they, yeah, they socialize with, mainly with other Jewish children. I said, but there's not many around here. So like neighbors, do they have non-Jewish friends? I don't know. Not so much, but anyway, I wanted to pick his brain. And he was very sweet. He's come to my house and we've laid tefillin together and said the blessings. And I've kind of trained him because he would just show up, and he may have shown up at your houses, but I said, that ain't gonna happen. So you text me, we'll see if I'm available next week. And I'll tell you, he'll do it. Whatever you say, the Chabad philosophy is amazing. We could learn a lot from it. First of all, their fundraising, they raise millions and millions of dollars. And their outreach as far as going to Jewish homes and helping people, giving them matzah, and giving them a menorah and encouraging them to participate without any, you don't have to come to any of my events, but I want to give you this menorah and I hope you will use it on Hanukkah. I will give you the, their methodologies are amazing. You can learn a lot from how they do it because it's become a science of how, it's so organized and so well done. And I used to think, oh, it's kind of subversive and they're going to process it and they're going to want me to come and, and it's not that way at all here. And their mission is to go to places where there's not a Jewish presence. There's one in Destin and there's one in Biloxi and there's one at every university campus. So you gotta hand it to them in that respect. Yes.
3 days ago, they showed up at Callie's house in Chickasaw in a wheeled one, and they went inside, they gave them a cookie, and so, he does all these things,
So it's very, we can learn some things, because it
And
works.
it's going wheels.
And, yeah. I'm gonna pass this around. If you're interested in looking at the 613, just skimming through it, it was 27 pages and I have to buy my own ink at school. So I just put it 2 on a page.
Do you have the website?
Yeah, you just go to Chabad.org and type in 613 commandments. Bam.
Glenn, I wanted to mention, I didn't want to interrupt, but I was looking up because I thought I remembered URJ has 2 different websites.
Okay.
One is urj.org.
Right.
One where you can find stuff about Reform Judaism.
Okay.
They have a separate
Okay,
website
how would you
called
like to hear that?
reformjudaism.org.
Say that again?
Reformjudaism.org.
Okay, I did not
And
know
that's
that.
where you find all the beliefs and practices and useful. It's different than
Thank you.
urj.org, but
Good.
both of them are owned by URJ.
Sure. Well, I'm glad to know that.
wanted to mention
Can we
that.
put that in the bulletin,
So,
maybe?
Sure.
To mention that, because I didn't know that, and that's the first place I'd like to go because we're members.
right.
And also I want the reform viewpoint more than I want any of the other ones, but that
I
would,
think a guest column in the bulletin by Glenn would be awesome every month.
don't do that.
I think that would it could be short and just
No.
say,
When I was president, I did the
Taste of
same
Judaism.
thing.
Yeah.
When somebody said, why don't we do something? I said, okay, you're in charge.
I think we need
I know that
Taste of
technique.
Judaism every month.
I know
It'd be
that
awesome.
technique. I know that technique.
There you go, done with it.
What's it do?
Yeah, yes to that. You
Are
had
the 2 greatest mitzvot I've heard, is it studying Torah and visiting the sick? Is it an opinion or is it,
Well, those are 2 biggies.
I would say, this is my view, is that in theory, all 613 commandments are of equal value. By the way, 613 doesn't mean we can practice all 613.
Bad girl.
There's only about 200 and some odd that are actually practice. The 613 includes sacrifices, include things that we're not capable of doing, nor would we want to do them today. Now, you mentioned two commandments. One is visiting the sick, and the other is studying Torah. There is what we would call dicta, meaning statements, but not really Jewish law, not really a commandment. For example, in the study of Torah, there's a big discussion not in this particular volume, but in the Talmud, if you took all the commandments and put them on one part of the scale, and you put the study of Torah on the other, they would be of equal. Why? Because then there's a big discussion, and why? Because the study should lead to the doing of commandments. I don't think Bikor Cholim is the ultimate commandment. I would, there's a lot of them that could be argued as the quote ultimate commandment. There's a discussion, I'll bring it in next time for our concluding. That again, there's another discussion in Talmud where they try to boil the whole Torah down to 12 verses, to 9 verses. What's the essence, of the Torah? What are the most important things? And they get down to the famous quote by Micah, which is to do justice, to love loving kindness, and walk humbly before God. That, then they get down to 1, which I think is something about acknowledging the sovereignty of God. So that's, all kinds of statements like that. But Bikor Cholim by itself is not the ultimate commandment. There's many that fall into that category, but I don't know if that's helpful.
If I may, in my studies, it was not nearly as intense as what the rabbi has studied, but I was taught that some of the highest mitzvot are ones where there's no reward or something that can come back to you in recognition. One of the coolest things in Judaism is Maimonides' levels of charity, which the rabbi is going to get to when we get to it. But it's one of my favorite things about Judaism, which is, giving not just to give, but to, it's why when people put names on buildings and names on plaques, that's great. But even more so is if you do it anonymously and, that kind of thing. And caring for the dead, no reward. Caring for visiting the sick. You're not doing it for any reward or acknowledgement or praise. Visiting people in mourning, caring for animals, things like that I was taught. Also, in the story of Hillel, when he was asked, I may be obliterating this story, but he was asked, Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, actually, that came originally from the Hillel story, which is where he was asked, this Judaism thing so complex, 613 laws, all this stuff, I want you to tell us everything there is to know about Judaism while standing on one foot, knowing that you can do that very long. So he did, and he says, do not do unto others as you do not want them to do to you. It was in the negative. And of course, in Christianity, it was flipped to the positive. It means the same thing. I'm not going to do something to you that I would not want you to do to me. But that's how he summed up all of it.
But what people sometimes leave off on that story is that he tells the person, the rest is commentary.
Right.
Now go and study.
Now go and study. That is true. Right. He said that's Judaism. All the rest is commentary. Yes.
The 10 Commandments, they are part of the 213, I assume.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, if after we're done with the presentation and you want to take a look at the Torah, I can show you exactly where they are.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so last week we left off where the rabbi taught us about the Tanakh, and which is the written law in Judaism. made up of the Torah and the writings and the prophets. Is that it? And so that's what we call the written law of Judaism. There is what's called the oral tradition, the oral law. And because it was handed down by word of mouth for centuries until finally the Talmud was closed. When? You got Brown?
Well, the dating of the Talmud is between 425 CE and about 700.
Is when they closed it, meaning that before that time, rabbis were sharing the stories, passing them down, discussing, debating around and around and around. And if you go to our board meetings, you can see how this process works. And you know, the old saying, if you get 4 Jews in a room, you have 5 opinions. And so they did this and then finally said, we're going to close it. I read some things about reopening the Talmud and things that, you know, so that those discussions can continue. Judah Hanasi, Judah the Prince, was credited, I think, with writing it all down finally.
In the most significant way, he compiled along with his colleagues the Mishnah, which forms that was about 220 CE, and the Talmud is 420s later, but the Mishnah became part of the Talmud, and we have this book here.
Yes.
And that is an edited version of this oral law. The only thing I would supplement, just add, just briefly, is that in Orthodox Judaism, there is a belief that not only the Torah was given at Mount Sinai,
Wow.
but that the oral law, which
I didn't know
the
that.
explanations were also given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. This oral law. So I just
Yes, and so it was compiled. And if you see, if you hear discussion about some of the Jewish laws, rules, for example, keeping kosher, and the word kosher comes from Kaddish, which is holy. And it's not just about food, it's the Torah has to be kosher. A talis, a tefillin have to be kosher. And when you hear that, you go, wait a minute, the Torah doesn't go into all this detail. Where does it say all these rules and things about keeping kosher? And all of that is in the Talmud, all the details. And it's divided into 2 pieces, 2 parts, the Talmud. And it's the Mishnah, which is the law, and the Gemara, which is the commentary on the law. So you'll read the law, which is the guts, and then the rabbis discussed it around and around and around. Rabbi Akiva said this, but Rabbi Hillel says that, but you know, and we read a lot from the Pirkei Avot, which is the sayings of the fathers, which is kind of the best of the best from the Talmud, would you say?
It's a separate work. Yeah.
And so
but it is part of it. Excuse me, I didn't mean to correct like that. It is part of the Talmud. If you purchase a set of Talmud, you will also have in one of the sections of the Talmud, you'll have a section that's called Avot. And that is similar, almost exactly as the Pirkei Avot that you were referring to.
And so the commentaries that go on and on and on and on. If someone's goat wanders on my property, I have to either return the goat, or you have to pay damages if the goat damages my fence. Mishnah. And this is not a true example, but kind of thing. Rabbi Akiva says, well, what if the goat wandered during Shabbos? Yeah, but it shouldn't matter when he runs through the Shabbos. What if he crosses over and there's no damage? Do I have to return it that day, or can I wait a week? Can I go? I mean, so we go into great detail. It's really written beautifully so that you can refer to the Mishnah and the commentary at the same time. And so the way it's done, I have to be very careful with this. Yeah. Is, if you can see, This is the Mishnah.
No, this is the parent of the Talmud. Right here is the Mishnah.
In the middle, that's the Mishnah, right?
Well, it is in the middle, but it's a limited part.
And the Gemara is written around it.
Not quite.
Okay, my bad.
I'm sorry.
No.
You need to, you never correct a colleague, and I'm not trying to, I guess I am. But, the way this, I've studied this for 9 years.
Yes, you have.
So, and I had a great teacher, so holding.
Maimonides, I think it was.
Sometimes I feel about that.
That's what I heard,
I mean, for our purposes, I mean, he's absolutely right. The Mishnah is in the middle, like where you see these. Well, let's see, where is it? It's, right there. You see how it's bolded there? Okay, it's written in Aramaic. That it's an abbreviation called matnitim, which means our Mishnah. Okay, so that's this restatement of an edited version of the oral law. And then you see here where it says where I'm pointing to right now, the different bolded part. You see that? That's where the Gemara begins. So actually, the main section contains both the Mishnah and the Gemara.
And what is surrounding it?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so this on the inside binding is Rashi. Rashi is a commentator from the 12th century. It's an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. He is recognized as not only the biblical, but the Talmudic commentator par excellence. Why? Because the Talmud is written in a very abbreviated form. And sometimes it's very hard to hold the thread together. One word or two words can stand for a whole principle that you have to know. And what Rashi does is he explains that. He doesn't give you his opinion. He's telling you how to understand, how to read the thread of the argument. This side, okay, is by the next generation after Rashi, some of whom were his grandchildren. These are called the Tosafot. The Tosafot means additional. Now what they did was they would find conflicting viewpoints of what was in the Talmud from a different section or a different practice that conflicted with either what Rashi said or with what the Talmud said, supposedly conflicted. What they tried to do was reconcile that.
So it's commentary.
Not commentary.
It's not part of Mishnah.
Oh yeah, right. So, excuse me. So, let me just. So the oral law, which you have to understand, what people don't understand usually, because they get confused. The oral law, in theory, in rabbinic Judaism, on what this book is based, is that God dictated this oral law to Moses at Mount Sinai. What's the significance of that? So, for example, it says eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, right? In the Torah, right? It says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But there is a Mishnah, this oral law that God taught to Moses, in theory. I mean, I can't prove it one way or the other. Orthodox believe this, so that's what you have to understand. So there's a Mishnah that says, if I injure you, I have to pay you damages. I have to pay you damages for that. Why? Because the Mishnah says so, this oral law. So the Gemara, the discussion part that Glenn so accurately referred to as being commentary, raises the question, this argumentative question, well, how can this oral law that was dictated, I'm putting in parentheses now, how can this oral law that was dictated by God to Moses provide a system of restitution when the Bible says literally, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth? You follow that? That's the nature of the Gemara, and then they'll begin to discuss. Now, the interesting thing about the oral law is that what we have in the Mishnah, which is an edited version of the oral law. People don't usually get this. There were a lot of things that were left out. This was written in 225 CE. If it was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, that's about 1250 BCE. And you're talking not only a long period of time, but you're talking about 2 exiles. And and it was forbidden to write down this oral law. So it was done orally, it was done with notes, and people would teach it, and so forth and so on. By the time 225 rolled around, the Jews were in exile, and there was a danger that, in fact, the oral law would be lost, would become so confused. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, this is history, actually wrote down the Mishnah, and that's what this is. We have it, this is what he wrote, along with many colleagues. This is historical, no question about it. But not everything that was in the oral law was put into the Mishnah. There was stuff that fell on the floor, so to speak. Imagine a movie reel, right? And this movie, when you make a movie, edited things get cut on the floor. But if it's from God, you can't leave it on the floor, right? You have to take it with you. So then you get a whole bunch of other books that are like that are considered to be part of this oral law. And then what the Talmud tries to do is take not only what the Gemara tries to do is to take to discuss the Mishnah, but also take this other stuff that seems to even conflict with the Mishnah and then try to reconcile. If that sounds confusing enough, it is confusing, and it's sometimes hard. And then, I'll give you an example, and this is really important because we talked about the Hasidim, right? When we talked about Lubavitch and their orthodoxy, and this is where to some extent we differ. In that, in the Orthodox view, the Jewish practice doesn't necessarily, here you have lots of different opinions. Even in the Mishnah you have, the very first Mishnah, the very first law in the Talmud is taken from, it consists of blessings. And it discusses a very simple question: from what time in the evening can you recite the Shema, and until what time do you recite the Shema and fulfill your obligation? It's a mitzvah, a commandment to say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It's a mitzvah, you're supposed to do it. And you're supposed to do it when you lie down and when you rise up. It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment, right? So the question is raised. The very first question is, from when to when what constitutes lying down, right? So the Mishnah provides us 3 different examples. You can do it till 9 o'clock in the evening, you can do it until midnight, or you can do it until the sun rises. And you don't know which one to follow, because it doesn't say which one is superior. Normally it's whatever the sages say, the majority view. But that indicates already in the Mishnah that there's a conflict. All these conflicts were resolved in orthodoxy by a book that was written in the 15th century called the Shulchan Aruch, meaning the arranged table. It's a wonderful book, don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful book. That is the Orthodox version of what the correct law is. Now, it's important for us to understand, and then I'm going to stop because we have so much ground to cover, that we don't necessarily follow the Shulchan Aruch. We as Reformed Jews, we don't. Or we don't necessarily, we leave it to the individual to decide, matters of consciousness and so forth. But for Orthodoxy, and particularly for the Hasidim, that is as much their Bible that resolves all of these kinds of controversies. But originally, a lot of these controversies were not resolved, even something as simple as that. Is that helpful to all of you now? Is that gives you some sense? The Talmud is an attempt to synthesize all that stuff through argumentation, through commentary, and so forth. But in the end, Talmud is like a fine wine. If I taste $100 bottle of wine, I'd be able to wine from $100. I wouldn't know. I don't have the first clue as to what wine is about. It takes a long time to develop a taste for it. Talmud is the same way. I'm going to pass this around. You can take a look at it if you want, get a sense of it. There's all kinds of commentary in the back.
And then,
That's enough.
and then Maimonides wrapped it all up beautifully, right? At the bit like,
Yes.
because their Jews were all around the world. He said, this is like our last shot to have a text.
So what he did,
Yeah.
because not everybody was educated. Very few people in the 12th century when Maimonides lived. Maimonides is like the Albert Einstein, I call him the Albert Einstein of Judaism. What he did, he took all of this, there's 39 volumes that are like that, 39 volumes. And what he did was he took out all the argumentation, condensed it all into very simple Hebrew, and you would know when is the time to recite the Shema, and it's very, and it's translations of it, and so he codified the law. And what's interesting is that, what's interesting about Maimonides is that in the middle of this rearrangement, he was an Aristotelian. He was trained in Greek philosophy and logic and mathematics and medicine. And what he did was he, for example, in his laws of repentance, I'll give you an example, he added his philosophy, his philosophical outlook. So you're reading about how to do repentance. In the middle of these laws of repentance comes a great discussion on free will. It seems like out of nowhere. Well, why? Because if God is omniscient, how can you commit sin? Right? If God is an all-knowing God, and God must know in advance, so how can you be held culpable for something that you did? So that's what Maimonides did. I don't want to get too far ahead. I'm done. I'm sorry. That took a little bit of time, but
No,
I
that's
think it's
very important. That's very important. And for plain old people like me, the way I look at the Talmud is, it's used by Reform rabbis, I think, more in referencing rules and laws and interpretations and sayings. That's why the Pirkei Avot is quoted so much by Reform rabbis. And so getting into the nitty gritty of what happens for an eye or tooth for a tooth, we don't get into. It's like what you asked last week about, well, did Moses go up and get the Torah or did he not? And so we look at these as stories and the meanings behind them and what can we take it to apply to modern day. If you look at the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, which is the Tanakh, and we call it the Bible, not the Old Testament, it's one book. He had it out. The Talmud is many, many volumes. Look, this is one volume of a set of the Talmud. In it, and by the way, there are two Talmuds, and if you want to mention that later when you're talking, is the Babylonian, which is the one we refer to, which was 500 AD or CE, and the Jerusalem, which was older. The Talmud is divided into 6 orders, because if you say, I want to look up about the eye for an eye, or I want to look up when is appropriate to get in a mikvah. Well, the Torah doesn't get into all those nitty-gritties, but the Talmud does. Where do I find that out of this many volumes? So it's divided into 6 orders, and the orders are divided into 63 tractates, and the tractates are divided into 517 chapters. So you'd say it's in 2nd order, 3rd tractate, 400th chapter, page 42, because the page numbers you can't go by because it's how they're compiled. I mean, some of them are, it depends how you divided them up. The 6 orders, which are interesting to me, is Zeraim, which is seeds. That's the first order. And it deals with prayer and blessings, agricultural laws, tithes, that type of thing. It has 11 tractates. Moed, which is festivals, pertaining to the laws of the Sabbath and the festivals. In other words, all these, you talk about Shomer Shabbos, keeping the Shabbat rules and not working. And what does not working mean? Well, is turning off a light, is that working? Is walking to the shul, is that working? All of those and about the festivals, and that's 12 tractates. Nashim, which is, I think, the most fascinating of the orders. It's called women. Nashim is women. And what that includes is the laws of marriage, divorce. If you've seen some of these shows on Netflix about the Hasidim wives who are not allowed to divorce their husbands and they try to get out of the marriages. Have you ever seen some of those things? And those are extreme cases because, you talk to Rabbi Goldwasser here and his wife, it's great. There's no, but all of those laws and how they're interpreted are in Nashim. and when is appropriate to do the mikvah. After each menstrual cycle, before a wedding, before, all of those things. It concerns marriage, divorce, forms of oath, and the laws of the Nazarite, which is 7 tractates. How many is that? Did I hit them?
So the mikveh is the bath, but it's like a ceremonial
Right, and
type of a
what
bath.
we
'Cause I mean,
do,
I've never seen one.
well, in Mobile, what was done in the early days, when my father was growing up here, is it has to be continuously running water. It can't be the same water used. So we go to the Gulf. When we grew up at the shul, the mikveh was, it was done before a wedding. It was done before major events. But they'd go to the Gulf. Now, Chabad built a $200,000 mikveh. Raised the money in a month, built it. Beautiful. It's like a spa. You walk in. What? Have you seen it?
When you look inside an ultra-Orthodox, it seems alien and strange, but there's a series, women in New York City invited cameras in, and it's so powerful to listen to these women, explain everything, that they run the household, and they are treated like a queen, and they take raising the children and everything throughout the day really seriously, and they take you through the mikvah. You can't have anything on your body, so no nail polish, you have to fully take everything off. It's just very beautiful. Everything is symbolic. They walk you through everything. They opened up their homes and they talked, it was really powerful. They talk you through covering the head and, with a wig, and it was so eye-opening and beautiful that they did that series for other women to watch. It's really kind of neat.
Sherry had to do it. And she, in Montgomery, happens to have a mikveh in the community, has had it for 50 years, maybe longer. And so when she was converted, we went to Montgomery at that time. And it had to be, and so you have to be completely undressed. And then it has to be a witness. Well, my mom was the witness. So if you can imagine poor Sherry, naked in front of her mother-in-law, to be. She was a good sport and did the blessings, and she remembers it to this day of the emotional aspect of it. It's really kind of a cool thing to do.
So Glenn,
Yes.
I of course, like I said last week, I don't know much, but I thought a mikveh was just for, like you're talking about, a conversion. But so do the Orthodox, is just Orthodox?
Well, not necessarily, not necessarily. And if you ask Rabbi Goldwasser, he will say, I don't care if you're Reform, if you want to come and use the mikveh, you can use the mikveh. It's, yes.
Just a couple of things to highlight. Rabbi Goldwasser, yes, anyone can use the mikveh as long as it's for one of the intended purposes that, as Chabad defines it. So for example, if I wanted to use the mikveh to convert someone, I couldn't use the mikveh for that purpose. There's a couple reasons for that. Even though my conversions are done according to Jewish law, according to Jewish tradition, the fact that I am not what's called shomer mitzvah, or they don't recognize me as one who keeps the commandments. For example, I don't observe the Sabbath strictly. I ride in a car to the temple, I go back. Occasionally, if it warrants it, I may send an email. I try not to, but sometimes I'm not so stringent. So therefore, my conversions can't be fully trusted. And it's not a personal thing. It just has to do with my status more so. So the mikveh, as I understand it, according to Chabad's rules, can't be used for that purpose. It can be used, say, for example, if you would like to go to the mikveh and just try it, you know, I think there's a small fee, I'm not sure, or a donation is a donation. You can, you know, as Glenn said, you know, you can certainly go and do that. It's generally done for two purposes. One is men will do it before Shabbat because it's a ritual bath for purity. It gets all of the, what's called tameh, impurity, the ordinary state out, and you become tahor, you become ritually pure. A woman goes to the mikvah 7 days 7 days after her menstrual cycle has ended, when there's no more appearance of blood. And of course, if you start doing the math, you begin to understand, you know, that there's a mitzvah kind of attached to it, which is to be fruitful and multiply, because that's the time when a woman would be ovulated. So before she can have relations with her husband, again, this is in strict Judaism, she would go to the mikvah, and the impurity of the blood, or in her state and so forth, she would become tahor, ritually pure, and then she could have relations with her husband. So those are two reasons why.
And
So if a man converts, does he have
Sure.
to do a mikvah?
any life cycle events, big life cycle events. Some people, after a traumatic experience even, could go into the mikveh. You know, some trauma or something, and you know, it's a mark. And by the way, for the prayer group, the new covenant with God took that concept and called it baptism. Because if you look at the new covenant, it's a lot of the things we still do as its original form. The matzah, breaking the bread, and the matzah, eating the matzah. And when Jesus sat at his Last Supper and said, "This is no longer the bread of affliction, but now is my body." And the wine which we bless in the Kiddush, that's now my blood. And so if you look at a lot of the traditions in Christianity, you can see how sometimes, you know, very ironically, how they can be traced back to the origins of what they were in Judaism.
You know, it goes back to what I said at the outset, and that is that unless you understand all the Jewish traditions, it's very difficult
That's
to
true.
fully understand the New Testament.
That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, that's why it's, you know, and that's a great way to look at it. I wish everybody did that.
Yeah.
To finish up the orders, so Nashim, then comes Nezikin, which is damages. Now we're talking about civil laws and criminal law and the functioning of the courts and oaths, all in Judaism. Once again, if you look at American laws and the Constitution, you can look at these and it's eerily similar to where we came from in America with the laws. Kodashim, which means holy things, is the next one, and that's regarding sacrificial rites, the temple, the dietary laws. That's where all the detail about the dietary laws. Because if you ask an Orthodox person, well, why do you have to, you know, they'll run the dishwasher empty in between a milchik and fleishik dinner. Why? Well, they're going to refer back to something that's mentioned probably in this. And the last one is Tahorot, which is purities, pertaining to the laws of purity, impurity, including the impurity of the dead, the laws of food purity, bodily purity. So that's the whole of it. And so and that's as far as my knowledge goes. So any other comment on any of
No, I
that?
think you covered it very well.
Yes.
Thank you.
So we've talked about it, you know, the Orthodox, Chabad, and wanting to adhere to all this. And you talked a little bit about where Reform Judaism done to, but what's the lesson? How should we look at the Talmud and all this other stuff?
As
Do
Reform
we
Judaism.
ignore it, or we just say it's part of Judaism? I mean, what's the lesson for Reform Judaism?
That's a great, I'll
connection
refer that to
we
you.
have to it.
That's, we need a reform rabbi to tell us that.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, please.
Is the Talmud translated to English?
Yes.
Yes.
We have it here in our library. You can go and look at, there's a one of the orders. And
I wouldn't
that's,
recommend this. I had to, when I was working in Talmud and needed translation because my Aramaic was like from scratch, this is what we had available. This is called the Sansino edition of the Talmud.
in English.
And, yeah, in English, I'll pass this around. And the joke was that in order to understand the Talmud, in order to understand what was written here, you had to go back to the original Talmud and to understand what was written. It was kind of a little bit of a joke, so because how you can't understand the Aramaic to begin with, but you can't understand this either. How about pass this around? There's much better translations available now, especially by a gentleman by the name of Adin Steinsaltz. I think he passed away. What he did a great thing. What he did was he took the entire Talmud, he actually finished it, and then he did two things. Number one, he added vowels to the text, he added punctuation to the text, so that you would know where the breaks are. In that edition, you'll notice in the center, there's no punctuation, there's no voweling. He added vowels and punctuation so you would know where to stop in order to figure out what the arguments were. Okay, so that's the one contribution. But the more important contribution was he translated, really provided a kind of running translation of the Talmud, including explanations in his commentary that was on one side of the page. Actually, it was not on the Rashi side, it was on the outside. And he redesigned the Talmud. It was an enormous undertaking, and that translation, his work was translated into English. And if you go on safaria.org, they have his entire thing posted. You can also buy an entire set or individual volumes if you're interested. So that if you want to study Talmud, and that's the reason why he did it, and he was kind of criticized by members, and he was a Hasidic rabbi, and he was criticized within his circles for doing that to some extent because they didn't want the Talmud to be made available to a wider audience. And he said he didn't want anyone to have an excuse any longer not to study Talmud, which is why he said he did it. So it is available. I would recommend that translation. And if you want the site, I'm happy to give it to you, and I'm happy to show anybody how to navigate the site. It's a little bit tricky, but it's not that complicated.
When I took, one of the things I do in my confirmation class was that, since that's the one we have in the library, we spent a couple of weeks, and just because they'd never opened a Talmud, they didn't know what it was, and I gave them an assignment to find information, and they had to find it, and then tell us what the Mishnah was and the Gemara from that.
Yeah.
Just to give them an inkling. I mean, they're not going to go to that much. But so Gil's question, I'm very interested in too. So as Reform Jews, how do we look at this big picture?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and I'll try to answer it as best I can. First, I was always interested in Talmud, and I wasn't going to go to HUC unless I could study Talmud there. And it's not one of the most widely studied areas. I wanted a classical rabbinic education because I felt that that would make a contribution to whatever congregation I would serve. I just had it in my head that way. And they had a great scholar there who had studied in the Eastern European yeshivot before the war, came over after the war, survived, and he was my rabbi, but he was also my teacher, both in rabbinical school. And if you want to understand his methodology, buy my book. Out of a fluke, my rabbinic thesis was published. So if you're interested in, it was called Understanding the Talmud, a Modern Reader's Guide of Study. And it was based on his theory that that the oral law and the written law and the Talmud were all one cake. you couldn't really understand, you can't divide out the oral law from the written law as it's set out in the literature. It's really all one. And the Talmud's goal was to try to create a unity. And there's some truth to that. I think there's two answers to your question. The first, that it provides us with a way of reasoning within the tradition to justify our practices. It grounds our practices in tradition. Not completely, because we look at the present historical moment to decide what's going to be meaningful to our congregants, what's going to be meaningful to us in our world. The Talmud was written under very, very different circumstances, but they were also trying to discern what it was that God wanted them to do. And some of the questions, even though the questions may seem simple, underneath are quite profound. So for example, I mentioned the Talmud talks about eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. How can you have if it's all one cake, how can you have a system of restitution where if I injure you, I have to pay you monetary compensation? Much like in America, it's almost exact, practically exact. How can that be justified if the Torah, which is superior to this oral law, says eye for an eye? And they go through it, but the implication is that we don't read the Bible literally. That in the tradition, it's not read literally, it's read to be understood the value of an eye in place of an eye. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but that's a tremendous advance if you're looking at fundamentalism versus liberalism, and is there something in the tradition that justifies a liberal reading of the biblical text as symbol? And there's a classic example. And so from those kinds of things, or diversity diversity of opinion, as I just mentioned with regards to the reading of the Shema. How certain are we about the oral law? Is it perfect? Was it a perfect transmission? And the answer is no. How can I prove that? Well, there's on the very outset, the very, very first Mishnah that's written down has 3 different opinions. So there's uncertainty about what the law actually is, what it is that God wants us to do, which is the basic question. Right? That's the fundamental question of any religion, is what is it that God wants from us? If you believe in God and you're looking at the Torah, you're looking at how we've done our history. So from that standpoint, I think it has great value. And BTW, some of the, for example, the prohibition of women doing commandments, doing time-bound commandments, like counting them in a minyan and so forth, how women's role was relegated. I don't believe it was based on social considerations, that women had to stay home and have the kitchen and so forth. I think there was a principle related to time-bound commandments that women just weren't obligated, and they tried to show that in scripture, various stories and so forth. But there's an argument to be made within the Talmud itself that women can be counted in the minyan. It's just over time and tradition, it's never been done that way. And the Shulchan Aruch, which codifies that principle, is what's followed by Orthodox. But that doesn't mean that we can't justify within the tradition, the counting of women in a minyan and have women assume full and equal rights, which is what we want, because we believe in egalitarianism. We don't, we believe that women should be equal, and we can ground that in our tradition. So I think for those reasons, there's a lot of value in the study of Talmud. Does that make some sense to you, Gil? I don't know, does that answer your question?
Well, it does,
Okay.
but then I'm
Please.
thinking,
Yeah.
I need a companion to that to tie that to the egalitarianism that you were talking about, that appeals to me, that I think, exemplifies the progress that the people would continue to make, to strive to the highest ideal. And is there a reformed companion to all of that?
There's not a reformed Talmud.
Well, not
Per se,
reformed,
right.
but something
Uh-huh.
that has some stature that I could use as a guide, because the way we do things today, we think it's in the highest tradition of Judaism, but maybe foreign.
When you say
The highest tradition is, as you have said, and my answer to you is that think of the Torah and the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, as being the highest. Okay, the Torah as being the highest, and the second would be the prophets, of which Reform Judaism is based. And the Torah is replete with all of that. You don't need a Talmud for those principles. And there's total agreement. I mean, Chabad will go out to, where there's been a hurricane and help Jews, and afterwards. I mean, they've been known, to do that after a storm, and we're all in agreement on that. We're all in complete agreement that you're right. The highest ideals are what the prophet says. But you can also look at for example, the Yom Kippur, the prophetic reading for Yom Kippur. What is it, the fast that I want? It's that I want, for you to take care of the homeless, to lift the yoke off of the oppressed, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. All of these high principles, right? Now, what's interesting is that you can go to Rashi, you can go to the Talmud, and you can look up, well, how does the Talmud treat those verses? There are tools that you can use and plug in that verse and see how historically our tradition has understood those verses and in what context, and that enriches our understanding and our historical connection to the past. But you're absolutely correct. In Reform Judaism, the highest principles are the principles that you've talked about. And I would argue, and Glenn, maybe you can comment on this as well, that the highest principles are the ones that Reform Judaism truly value. But how that translates into actual practice, of course, is something we all need, all of us, myself included. We need to continuously work on, and we're doing it like with the Social Action Committee and in our community.
In my experience, over the years, I noticed that many Reform rabbis refer to the Pirkei Avot, which is really not a Reform Talmud, but I think it is useful in doing what you're saying.
Okay.
I have a copy. You can get a copy. It's great because it kind of takes some of that essence of the Talmud and puts it into that use. And so the Pirkei Avot is what a lot of Reform rabbis use in that respect. Yes, ma'am.
So, I just made a note here. A few years ago, after studies, I had to choose between being conservative or reform.
Yeah.
And so maybe this helps to answer, and I wrote down that I had more freedom in my relationship with God, but I felt really pulled to the Reform as a community, like true community. And then also I was really attracted to free will.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's a connection. There's a guide, there's a very traditional guide though that, would guide me through Reform. And, and that helped my behavior. Like it felt beautiful in the freedom, yet, so there were a few aspects why I chose Reform. I guess, I felt like a seed and not something that was already set like a tree. Like I felt, but the tree though was in the community. I just felt pulled to the beauty of that in Reform.
That's a beautiful way to
versus
say it.
conservative. Yeah.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And like all of Judaism is a spectrum. We talked about the orthodoxy. Well, in Reform Judaism, there's a spectrum. You know what I mean? Of what you find most meaningful,
Right.
and your interpretation of that.
But what Rabbi says, but if you want to do,
Yeah.
the community I studied with in Birmingham, there was a group of women, to do everything that religious, all the practices. If that pulls you closer to God,
Right.
then you have the freedom to do that. Too.
Well said.
Okay, here's my question. Can we talk about God? And what is our concept of God?
Well, you go first. And I've got some comments on it.
Well,
I'm glad you said that, because I was a little bit,
No,
you know,
it
it's
is.
a little loaded, but I'm.
No, it's a very good question.
Yeah, pressure too is.
I would, let me address it in three ways. First of all, I think there is an element of irrationality, that in order to have a connection to God, whatever, I'll leave that undefined, one has to suspend their rationality. And by that I mean, um, you have to develop a relationship of some kind with God. We're limited in terms of our language. We can only communicate or talk to God, quote, talk to God through language, which is very limiting, very limiting, to find the right words. God is incorporeal, which is a very difficult concept to wrap your head around, because we're taught, God is a kind of a father figure. But God is, in the way that it's portrayed in the Torah, is that way. And to go back to the Talmud, the only answer the answer that they give is because the Torah is written in the language of human beings, so that human beings can understand God in the way that, in just a human way. But God is beyond that. So you wrestle with that dynamic, when we pray, it's almost as if God is some kind of an object or a person that's out there. God, we ask you for mercy. We ask you for compassion. God sits on a throne on Rosh Hashanah and judges. But there's also a psychology to that in our relationship to God, we are expressing our own mortality and our own limitation and acknowledging that. I don't know if that makes some sense to you. There's a psychology to it. At the same time, a fundamental need that all of this somehow means something. And the Torah provides us with, religion provides us with that. So that's kind of the first thing. I think the second thing, so do I pray to God? Yeah, I do. When I'm probably vulnerable, or when my family feels vulnerable, and I do pray most every day. That's for my wife. She said, would you like to put Phil and Talit and daven this morning? So I'm a rabbi, of course I should be doing that, So I recite traditional prayers. Why? Well, because that's what I was taught. I understand the depth of the meaning of those prayers. I know them by heart, so it becomes a kind of mantra. So I don't have to focus on reading. I can just focus on the underlying meanings of compassion and love and justice and righteousness. And it kind of frames my day. It kind of frames the way that I try to approach each day. So I find God as helping me become a better person in some ways. So that is a second. And finally, I find great comfort in what Maimonides has to say. He's sort of my go-to person. That the commandment is to love God, right? In the Shema, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And Maimonides, at the end of the laws of repentance, says that you can only love God to the extent that you know God. And of course, none of us can know God completely. God is beyond the human mind. God is beyond that. But I think what he means, and he gives examples, not just the study of Torah, but the study of all subjects and the learning and the knowledge that you get from that brings you a better understanding of God. When you study mathematics, or when you study piano, when you learn the Chopin prelude, for example, it's not just the prelude that you're learning something about the universe. You're learning something about humanity. And as you begin to learn more about that, your knowledge of God increases, that's according, and so therefore your love increases. He analogizes it to a marriage, where when you first get married, you get, there's a lot of physical excitement, right? But as you grow in that marriage, when you grow in those intimate relationships, it changes. It changes emotionally. You have a better understanding, you have a deeper understanding of your partner, of the person you love. Love takes on a different characters, a different, a more substantive part of the human soul. And I think, and I kind of think that that it helps develop one's consciousness and one's sensitivity to the world around us. That's my answer. Glenn, would you like to?
Well, mine is more of a layperson answer. I mean, I think that's a beautifully put answer rabbinically. As a layperson, which means don't go by me. No, I'm serious, but the way I look at it is, and what I tell my Christian friends, is that Christianity is a religion of belief. You believe that Jesus is the Son of God, Lord and Savior. If you believe in Jesus, you're saved. Correct me. And of course, action is important in that belief. In Judaism, it's not about the belief. You can believe whatever you want to believe. Judaism is a religion of action. Mitzvot, doing, and a lot of people misinterpret the word mitzvot as good deeds. It's not good deeds. It's commandments. We do them not to feel warm and fuzzy and not to get something in return, but we do it because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. You do it. So it's a religion of action. Now, of course, you have to believe something in order to act on it. The central core of our belief is the Shema. Okay? The Lord is one. But I would argue that when I go back to my definition of Judaism, where it's the 7 aspects of a civilization, one of them deals with God. One of the 7. Culture, literature, laws, land, people. All of those things are in addition to the religious part. So my argument is you're going to find Jews, Reform Jews especially, who are on a broad spectrum of their view of God. I would also argue that there are Jews who don't believe in God. I doubt the existence of God. And this is a personal thing I'm sharing with you. As a scientist, I don't see much difference than stepping on a bug is when you die. You're gone. Now, my wife, and I hope she's right, we argue about this all the time. Well, so it's for nothing? There's no soul, there's no something. I mean, and I always say, I hope you're right. But scientifically, I think you're done. And you just no longer exist. And the same thing about God. So I doubt the existence, but I'm a Jew and proud of it. And is it hypocritical, and I deal with this a lot, to sit there in services and pray to God if I doubt his existence? I grapple with that. But for some of the reasons the rabbi says, and you said the community, for comfort, and also what is God? And it could be, in my opinion, the energy of the universe. Because Einstein proved that the energy is a defined amount that's just transformed from one type to another, but the total energy of the universe maintains the same. And so, you know what I mean? And it's the same argument I give to my Christian friends when they say that the earth was created, that the universe was created in 7 days. And I was like, well, it's like dog years. What is a God year? It could have been 1 billion years. You know what I mean? We don't know what 7 days biblically means. So in my opinion, you can interpret it any way you want. and still be a Jew, to me.
Because to me, I mean, I struggle with it too. And prayer. So, I don't see prayers answered. So to me, my interpretation of people praying is like maybe comfort for themselves or the comfort of the rituals.
Right,
And I think there is comfort, definitely
that's what I
in
do.
in rituals and our traditions and all of that. But I just, when you look around the world, I
Right.
hate to get so philosophical.
No, but how can it be?
I just don't see where
Right.
prayers are answered.
And it depends on, a lot of people would say, I talked to an Orthodox rabbi once who said that he looked at God as like a parent. You're holding the parent's hand and then you walk down the street and it's time to cross the street and the parent says you're on your own. That maybe God has no control over all those things.
Does God have control?
Well, that's an opinion.
Does God what?
Is there control?
It depends. See, in my opinion, it's what you think. That there's no ultimate answer. And if you ask several rabbis, they're going to give you several answers.
We'd love to see you Friday.
Yes.
What'd you say?
And we'd love to see you Friday evening to talk more about it.
Since Norman and I have talked about this a good bit.
Yeah, and I would like to hear your thought on this.
First of all, I do believe in God. But I do not think God is turned off by your doubt or Norman's doubt.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think God is always hoping that you will believe in Him. So that's my approach to it. It's not, doubt is not bad.
But do you think it's a man in the sky?
Personification.
I mean, do you think it's
It's beyond anything the human
that you can
mind
comprehend?
can imagine.
I understand.
That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I can see that.
The sky is a limitation of being human.
Yeah,
Right. Now, if I'm looking for some example on this earth, what I look at is the relationship between a father and a child.
right.
That's, to me, if you're looking for something that looks like it, and just think about how that parent feels about that child. And that's the way God feels about us. That's my concept.
But there's so many parents.
What's that?
I said, wouldn't that
doesn't
be
feel
nice
that
to
way.
put?
Yes, it is. It is. But and even though I have trouble with it, it's nice.
But it's okay.
It's-
But it's okay that you have trouble with it.
in one of the stories that came out of the Holocaust, what Elie Wiesel talks about, and I actually met him. He came to Auburn and spoke. Is that if anybody would deny God's existence, it would have been the people in the concentration camps. And they doubted him, and they said, and they were angry at him. And he said, it didn't matter, you can be as angry with him as you want, and you can doubt it, and you can fight it, but they never abandoned the idea that he existed. And so, but I don't think it's a man in the sky. See, I think and if it's anything, it's a concept we can't put our mind around.
Comprehend.
And so but yes.
I like that sentiment about the parent and child, and I fully agree that connection to other humans is, to me, some evidence that there's something greater than the two of us that are connected. But another time I think of God is the dozens of sunrises I've seen where I just felt it was so majestic and powerful, and I can't believe I'm so special. I'm here to see this. And it was so beyond comprehension before that sunrise happened, and after it happened, I went, wow.
Yeah,
there's
that's
so much
God.
going on.
Maybe that's God.
It's a lot.
There's a chapter in my book that's on that exact thing.
Yeah.
That after my cancer treatments, I thought when I held my daughter, my firstborn, in my arms almost 40 years ago,
Sure.
that was God.
I want to add something. Norma mentioned the word prayer, and I'm glad you did, because one time after class, Danette started telling me about different kinds of prayers, you know? Some prayers are requests, some are a pledge, others are self-soothing, you know, and some are written and some are spoken and some are thought. I love that there's such a big spectrum because it brings it back to what you said about how it's what you want to make of it. I mean, some people do nothing but request favors.
Yeah,
And others do nothing but pledge, and some are a spectrum, you know, so.
you know, that you see these football players, you go, thank God we won the game. And I'm thinking, you really think God had time to, is that, I mean, I have you know,
Yeah.
really? God let you win that game?
Or it's, you know, the whole thing like #blessed. I mean, we like that, right? Well, okay, now what are you gonna do with that?
Right,
Just
right,
say that, right? Like,
right.
yeah, say that.
Although gratitude is a special thing, and,
Yes.
and I'm always a better person when I get into gratitude gear, you know, and drive.
All the
So,
time.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think I'd be a rabbi if I didn't, you know, believe is an understatement, if I didn't feel some connection. I think it would be hard.
Sure.
I think it's hard for anyone who's holding the, you know, the position of either a pastor or being a rabbi. It's not that I don't have doubts, and particularly when things are hard, you know, doubts do, you know, can certainly be there. And are to be, you know, I've felt them, you know. Anyone who's gone through a hardship of some kind, whether it's a loss of a loved one or a serious illness, those things, you know, those things are hard, and you wonder, I think to some extent, you know, where is God when you see the stuff that's going on in the world?
How do you reconcile
I
that?
think that, well, I think our perspective is not, I hate again to anthropomorphize God because it's incorrect, is not God's perspective. If God is incorporeal and God is beyond any kind of physical matter and is pure, I don't know what, spirit or beyond our comprehension, then God's, quote, perception, quote, as it were, is not the same. And God can, quote, see, close quote, things that we just can't see. And we don't see all the good that happens if the judgment aspect is correct. We don't see all the good that people do for one another in the world. We see a lot of the bad stuff. And particularly after the Holocaust, you know, how do you believe in an interventionist God? You know, you look at the story of the Exodus. How do you believe in that after what happened? You know, there's no way to really comprehend that, except for me. First of all, you can't base a theology or a rejection of theology on such extreme events, because they're just out of the realm of anything that resembles humanity. Otherwise, you lose your faith altogether. You lose your faith altogether. And I talked about faith on Friday. But I do know that the people that have impacted me tremendously were people who survived, and that gives me sort of the mantle, as it were. Not the mantle is the right word, but but sort of the duty, the mitzvah, if you will, to kind of carry on. If not for my sake, and I think my life has been enriched because of Judaism, because of the Torah and everything, but clearly enriched and clearly given to me by these kind of people who I know went through hell. My teachers survived the Shoah and taught me the Talmud. A woman up in Hanover, New Hampshire, Betty Lau, who's still alive, She was my gabbai, which is somebody who stands next to me as I read Torah, raised a family. She wrote a book called Hiding in Plain Sight. I would highly recommend it. It's a recounting of her experience. It's extraordinary. And here she is, raising a family Jewishly, coming to the temple every Shabbat. Prayed in the Catholic Church while she was hiding. She would go to the church. And she says that, you know, it was a source of great comfort for her and helped her get through. My bar mitzvah teacher was a survivor. I mean, so, you know, when I look at their, or the first cantor that I had as a student rabbi was awesome. And he brought all of his melodies and all of his chazanut to our, you just feel enriched as if you've been given something beyond a Rembrandt, something beyond, you know, that's so valuable, so enriching that, you know, how can I, you know, not? I mean, it's hard to explain. It's because it's a paradox, right? But I think God lies to some extent in the relationship that we have with people who have influenced our lives. You know, I think God lies in those bonds and those that passing on of things, however you want to characterize it.
Well, I think it kind of goes when you have difficulties in your life and you say to yourself, God's not giving me more than I can handle. And you start to think, okay, how am I going to handle this? And you start to explore people that have had something worse happen to me, because I'm on, you know, somebody's in a worse place than I am. And when we talk about science, well, we have science because of God.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
question, and it's fair.
Yeah.
It's fine to question, but we question because God gives us the ability to question.
I love that. That's true.
That's just.
Yes, sir.
When you were talking, Jeanette thought of something that I was thinking at the same time. Last year, the first time I saw that Torah rolled out, I felt it was greater than the sum of its parts. I felt it. It was strong, and I think if we visit it today, you'll see the same thing. It's pretty
Did you
amazing.
want to sum up? I have more.
Well, I think, no, and our time is right on the button. Well, a little bit. On Jewish time, we're right on time. And,
Somebody, somewhere.
but this was a great day, and I thank the rabbi, of course, and all of you. Next week, so to get you to come back, we're going to talk about life cycle things. Why we wear a tallis. Why is a yarmulke in Reform Judaism optional? Death, marriage, life cycle events. And if you want to hit some of the controversial ones, I'm going to let Rabbi handle the abortion and things like that. But I hope you do come back. Yes, sir?
So next week, 6 hours then? 5?
No, I know. We're on page like 1.5 of 5
I'm not teasing
of our
you.
outlines. But we discussed,
You're also enriching with your questions and your comments, really.
Yeah, that's the fun part.
So, very, very helpful for me.
and we decided ahead of time that however far we got was going to be okay. Yes, sir.
Will next week include natural extension of God, heaven?
Of what?
Heaven.
Yeah, I'd like to address that. We'll
Okay.
do that.
If you
And
would.
then I'm sure the rabbi has a,
Because you only
Right.
come back if we talk about heaven,
No,
is that what you're
no,
saying?
well, one of the
I just know I've
things,
had a few conversations with Norma, and it's a natural extension of, do you believe in God?
sure.
If you do, then
Well-
is there a heaven?
One of the 5 top questions I get from Christian friends
Right,
is, do you believe in heaven and hell?
Yeah.
What did you say about Jesus?
Yeah.
Do you believe in heaven and hell? Well, I mean, I can give you, and in any conversation, those 5 are going to come up. And so
That
I'll
would be
mention it. I have an abbreviated version. I'm sure the rabbi will have more rabbinic version of what the answer is. But I hope you do come back.
Yeah, I hope you all do. You're all wonderful.
Yeah, this is great.
I'll come back either
Tell
way.
your friend, bring your friends. Thank y'all very, very much. And Rabbi, you still going to do your field trip?
For anybody that wants to stay, I know it's 8 hours late, but I'm happy. I have to be here till 4 anyway, so I'm happy to do that. But if you're tired and you need to leave, please go and